Why do you think Israel is so attractive to U.S. law enforcement agencies?
U.S. policing has always been both about enacting a war on Black and brown communities in the U.S. and around the world. So I think that the two being both rooted in racism and state violence, there's a real natural attraction and a desire to trade tactics.
Al Jazeera presents itself as a professional news network, but it is owned by the Gulf state Qatar, a supporter of both the Muslim Brotherhood and Hamas. So when the network's online arm ran a 9-minute video in July attacking programs that take American police leaders to Israel, accuracy and fairness were not in the equation.
To understand why these trainings are so problematic, you first need some background about how Israel systematically dehumanizes the Palestinian population it completely controls.
As you are about to see in the second of our two-part investigation, attempts to blame police exchanges that take American cops to Israel for problems in American policing are lies predicated on opposing anything to do with Israel. In stories like Al Jazeera's or in supposedly critical research reports, there's not one example showing anything from an Israeli police exchange hurting anyone in America. In part 1, we saw how one of the main groups pushing this false narrative, Jewish Voice for Peace, now acknowledges that anti-Semites are eager to exploit a message that blames Israelis for police killings of black people in America. But for nearly 3 years, JVP said police exchanges with Israel lead to extrajudicial executions, shoot-to-kill policies, police murders. Now it says such talk, quote, shifts the blame from the United States to Israel and furthers an anti-Semitic ideology. JVP has tried to hide this fact and pretend it did not fuel the very anti-Semitic narrative it now warns about. Organizers and participants in the exchanges agree there is no hands-on training. What they learned, in fact, often stands in direct contrast to the allegations made by people who simply oppose Israel's existence.
My experience was nothing even close to what they said was the purpose of the executive level leadership training. None of the information in regards to any type of policing against any demographic, because that would go totally against my beliefs and totally against the professional law enforcement that we know.
And I've not talked to colleagues that have gone on these where they come back and say, man, you're not going to believe what we learned about crowd control, or you're not going to believe what we learned about new interrogation techniques. That's not the conversations that I've had with colleagues. It's how the Israeli police has a respect for human rights and civil rights, a accountability system that includes the courts, and how they do a very good job under difficult circumstances.
That kind of exposure to police leaders elsewhere in the world can help groom the next generation of leadership at home. That's what former Atlanta Police Chief George Turner realized after his trip to Israel.
The second thing that I'd like to really talk about is how well prepared their leaders were, their commanders were. They had a leadership institute that was really, really impactful for me. So I began to think about how we could do something similar to that in Atlanta.
After becoming chief, Turner created the Atlanta Police Leadership Institute. He's proud of the success the program's alumni have enjoyed.
And so because of that, there are at least 10 police chiefs around the country that came out of the city of Atlanta, in Durham, in Montgomery, in South Fulton, and throughout the country that are now leading departments around the country because they had a chance to participate in leadership development in our city.
In short, there are more black men and women serving as police chiefs in America because of an idea George Turner brought back from Israel. That's not in the JVP or Al Jazeera reports. Unable to support the claim repeated at protests and by anti-Israel activists that black people are killed as a result of the exchanges, the critics focus instead on police practices used throughout the world.
The tear gas that was being used in occupied Palestine was the same tear gas that was being used in Ferguson.
And she's right. Officers in Ferguson used the same U.S. manufactured tear gas and flashbang devices to disperse crowds that Israeli forces regularly use against Palestinians.
This is one of the more confusing allegations critics of the exchange programs make. If the overall point is that Israel somehow is influencing American police to be more violent and oppressive, it's not clear how Israel's use of American-made tear gas is proof of anything. And it casts Israel as some outlier in using tear gas for riot control, but canisters made by Combined Systems, the Pennsylvania-based manufacturer, are used throughout the world. It's one thing to debate the use of tear gas, but singling out Israel, as JVP and Al Jazeera do, is an example of demonizing or stereotypical allegations about Jewish power and control over the government that is part of the U.S. accepted definition of anti-Semitism. And if the exchange program somehow encouraged police executives to use tear gas to quell peaceful protests, the lesson did not take with Turner during his tenure in Atlanta. His officers had to deal with local Occupy Wall Street and Black Lives Matter protests. While there were arrests, not one canister was fired.
In the city of Atlanta, we are the Mecca Center, if you will, for civil rights movement and First Amendment, people having the ability to express themselves. And one of the things that I said when I was the chief of police, we want to encourage you to afford you your ability for your First Amendment right to protest. However, we will not stand by and allow you to violate and criminalize our city and damage our city.
And in Olympia, Washington, Chief Ronnie Roberts, who went on an exchange to Israel in 2016, did generate controversy for his approach to protesters. But it wasn't for using force. It was for going too easy.
We do a lot of protests where we're from. I mean, there's a lot of local protests. And we had learned to manage those really well by basically facilitating the people's First Amendment rights to do what they need to do. When there's violence, we get involved and we do what we have to do to stop that violence.
In 2017, environmental activists were protesting Olympia's port for accepting shipments of fracking sand, which was then loaded onto trains and distributed to oil fracking sites outside the area. Some protesters were blocking train tracks and damaging public property. Roberts showed up at a public meeting in uniform to encourage port leaders to consider that while the cargo was profitable, it might not be worth the cost to the community.
It angers me to have to put our officers in combat gear and face off with members in our community over something I don't believe in myself. The port has put me between a rock and a hard spot, and I don't want to be a part of it, but I don't get a choice to not protect our community. It is a mandate for police. I implore the port to look for options and solutions that are compatible with our community values, which have been so clearly stated by council.
A state lawmaker demanded Roberts' ouster. Agree or disagree with the chief's statement, it's clear he didn't come back from Israel inspired to inhibit protesters' free speech rights or to oppress anyone. According to JVP and Al Jazeera, though, Israel also is teaching American cops how to use surveillance to oppress minorities.
And then there's surveillance. Israel's massive surveillance system has inspired U.S. officials so much so that after a former police chief visited Israel in 2008, his city adopted its techniques.
Our Video Integration Center in downtown Atlanta is modeled after the Command and Control Center I saw in the old city of Jerusalem.
But protests and oppression were the last things Chief Turner had in mind when he was inspired by the old city's video integration system.
They had a large scale of cameras that they were able to bring it into a centralized location to be able to use that data to make decisions from. And for me, I think that if you think about a camera being in the public space, it's no different than having a police officer standing on the corner as a, if you will, a beat officer on the corner. I don't think in our society you have a expectation for privacy when you're on the city streets. And so ultimately, what I envisioned that we would use these set of cameras to be able to utilize this to make sure our citizens and our visitors were safe as possible.
Turner didn't have the budget to buy and install thousands of cameras, but Atlanta businesses already had installed their own networks of cameras to protect their properties. Turner was able to tap into those existing systems and route their images to a centralized police system.
That network of cameras gave us an opportunity to not only reduce crime or to prevent crime from ever occurring, but it also gave us the evidence that we needed to clear those cases that had taken place on our streets and take those cases to court.
He also studied surveillance systems in London and Chicago, something JVP and Al Jazeera didn't mention.
If it's a good idea, and you had a chance to see it involved in another country, why isn't it still a good idea?
And the reality is, there have been a lot of bad things happening in our country for many, many, many years, and probably long before any police officer ever a police leader stepped foot on ground in Israel.
For Roberts, the trip provided spiritual clarity too. Again, not in the way critics might think.
When I landed in Israel, and I began to really walk where Jesus walked as a Christian, the Holy Spirit started to transform me and started to do work in me, and some things started to come alive. And it was really what it was about, was seeing things more clearly about who I am and how I can lead my police department and my community through my faith, with a focus on peace and caring about people where they're at. And I just really began to see broad aspects of our community in a much better way.
Among the most profound experiences was a trip to Akko, a seaside town in northern Israel with vibrant Muslim, Jewish, and Christian communities. They all met in the mosque to talk.
It was one of the most rewarding experiences that I had there, frankly, was to be in a community with a police leader, sitting down, having a conversation in a mosque. Just never in my wildest dreams or worlds would I've ever thought that would happen. And then lo and behold, I come back to Olympia, and there had been some national things kind of going on around focus on mosques, and just saw the opportunity we didn't have one in our specific community, but one that was in our neighboring community, and just reached out and said, let's have a conversation and talk. And they welcomed us there. And we sat on the floor, we participated in services and prayer, and it was just a powerful experience. And it was a reminder of when we step forward and we step into those spaces, that really powerful things can happen, like the building of relationships and the breaking down of stereotypes.
That's not to say the trips don't emphasize law enforcement approaches, especially when it comes to terrorism.
But certainly, they have learned over decades of fighting terrorism. They've seen it all, and they've experienced it all. And I am fond of pointing out that if the response to an attack, to a terrorist attack by law enforcement, responding to it, all the command and control structures that you need to set up, the methods of dealing with the forensics at the scene, all those are identical no matter who attacks you. The processes that you need to employ, which will not only have a major impact on whether or not you solve the case at the end, but also at the scene, how many lives you lose and how many people you can save through a well-planned response and a well-integrated response. It doesn't matter who the perpetrators are.
How the Israel police handled a suicide bombing scene. How do you arrive there? What do you do with the victims? How do you collect forensic evidence? How you secure the area? How you evacuate the injured to the hospital, and things of that nature.
When there is a terrorist attack, how important it is to quickly get in, process, gather the evidence, and allow a sense of normalcy to begin to develop in those areas, which is very different in the way that the United States handles those kind of events. Oftentimes, things are shut down for weeks, if not months. If not, the area is eventually turned into a memorial. And the psychology behind why they do it differently there.
JVP's Deadly Exchange report never acknowledges the pervasive deadly terrorist threat Israel faces daily. Instead, it casts the exchanges simply as a tool to promote oppression. Again, that's not what the participants we spoke with experienced, and no one has produced a source who claims otherwise. But that has not slowed the false narrative. Robert Friedman, who founded the Georgia International Law Enforcement Exchange, or GILEE, believes it's simply a reflexive opposition to anything having to do with Israel.
You have the pro-Palestinian groups on one hand that have been able to co-opt the Black Lives Matter and supporting groups to their cause. And on the other hand, those have been doing exactly the same by co-opting the Palestinians to their cause. So you would see a cartoon of an American officer with his knee on a black detainee, depicting the incident with George Floyd. And then near him, you see an Israeli police or military guy with his knee on a Palestinian. And the message is that Israel is actually teaching that kind of chokeholds or that kind of brutality towards minorities. And that is basically what they're trying to do. It's called intersectionality. The problem is that it's concocted. It has no foundation, no basis, no evidence.
It's a message anti-Israel activists have pushed for years.
The liberation of the Palestinian people, in my opinion, is intertwined with the liberation of black people in America and all over the world. When black people are free, we're all going to be free.
We are one, sisters and brothers, and our liberation is bound up together. The same people who justify the massacres of Palestinian people and call it collateral damage are the same people who justify the murder of black young men and women.
It's another libel. The Jews are responsible for all these horrible things in history, as the blood libel, the poisoning of the wells in the Middle Ages, both world wars, and now guess what? They're also responsible for what's happening in America at the hands of police and to people of color.
They don't deal with facts. They deal with emotions. And when they appeal to emotions, then it's very difficult to cope with that.
A lot of people repeat what others say without any evidence or their own experience from what they've seen or what they've heard, without any personal experience. They empathize with someone else's story, which is good. It's okay to empathize, but when you repeat it without understanding or without true facts, we see a lot on social media right now in which people are just retweeting false information or sharing information without the full story. That impacts the community as well, because that brings fear to the community of this may be happening here when it's not.